everyone, and welcome to the Build for Equity Report Briefing and Recommendations panel discussion. My name is Lauren Cantel. I am NNSTOY's Director of Project Management, and I'm located out in Los Angeles. And I am so excited to introduce our new President and CEO, Scott Meltzer. Scott, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and welcome everyone.
Thank you, Lauren, and thanks to all of you for joining us this morning. As Lauren said, my name is Scott Meltzer, and I'm thrilled to join the National Network of State Teachers of the Year as their president and CEO. As a first-generation college graduate and AmeriCorps alum, I'm deeply passionate about helping all students and schools to succeed. My teachers are the reason I was able to stay on track during tough times in my childhood, and later to pursue a career in public education partnerships as an adult. My teachers were my mentors and my role models, making sure learning was both meaningful and fun. In fact, during my interview with the National Network of State Teachers of the Year, I had the opportunity to share the impact of my 8th grade science teacher, Patty Littlejohn. They are why I believe that teachers make all careers happen in our country. And that's why the work of NNSTOY matters so much. Current partners and stakeholders, I also want to take the opportunity to welcome our new partners and stakeholders across the country and share a little bit about NNSTOY's mission and our vision. There's no organization like NNSTOY in the country. NNSTOY is a national network of state teachers of the year and finalists who are committed to the teaching profession and student achievement by focusing on the practices and policies in public education. They are all educators who understand the education landscape from the grassroots all the way to the grass top perspectives. NNSTOY is unique in that we elevate teacher leaders through in-depth leadership capacity building, such as through our partnership with Voya Financial for the National STEM Fellowship and the National Education Association Foundation and Curriculum Associates for the Teach for Equity Professional Development course, as well as through our direct support of school districts, such as Prince George County Public Schools and DODEA, or the Department of Defense Education Activity, which is the public school system serving our military students and families across the globe. But I want to touch on why this report matters. Shared value partnerships have helped us make progress with teacher leadership. One partnership that we're thrilled about is our work with ETS. Our partnership is the reason for this Build for Equity report, which focuses on how education decision makers can better diversify the current teacher workforce and pipeline. As everyone here is aware, the education workforce has seen a dramatic shift over the past several years, resulting in teacher shortages. While attrition and general career attrition rates have been low for some time, there are a few notable events that have happened all within the past couple of years to exacerbate this challenge. First, the global COVID-19 pandemic forced every teacher to figure out how to teach virtually while also meeting the diverse needs of students completely on their own. Second, our country continues to experience a reckoning of how we teach our history in a way that is truthful and honest while not washing away the injustices that have occurred through racist actions of individuals, government systems, education systems, and communities. Lastly, education has been once again thrust into political crosshairs, dissecting how teachers teach and what they teach with the real fear of being reprimanded in some way. All of this has created a space where people don't feel a calling to the teaching profession. There are too many barriers, particularly for educator candidates of color. Representation in the classroom matters. However, Black teachers are twice as likely to leave the profession than their white counterparts. This number should hit even harder when you know that 79% of public school teachers in the United States identify as white, even though only 46% of students identify as white. Even more striking, 40% of our schools do not have a single teacher of color on staff. However, when students of color have just one teacher that looks like them before 3rd grade, they're 13% more likely to enroll in college. That percentage more than doubles when they have 2 teachers of color before 3rd grade. This is why it is critical that we diversify the teacher workforce as we continue to address teacher shortages, and why I'm thrilled our Build for Equity report in particular can be used to address this urgent matter in the United States. This report is teacher written, teacher designed, and teacher led, and it is intended for districts and systems of education to use this report as a guide in your educator workforce pipeline development. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from this briefing before you click the leave webinar button, it's that I want you to focus on the component or components you or your school or your district or organization are working on towards building or enhancing your teacher diversity work, no matter your vantage point in public education. So let's get into it. This report could not have happened without the incredible team at ETS and their steadfast partnership with NNSTOY. It is my pleasure to introduce ETS's Center for Advocacy and Philanthropy Senior Director and ETS lead on Build for Equity, Dr. Jamal Watson.
Thank you so much, Scott, and congratulations to you and your new role. Looking forward to working with you. Our environment is changing faster now than at any previous time in human history. We're facing challenges in demographics, skills, and culture, not to mention emerging technologies, career specialties, and even new vocabulary. Clearly, we need faculty and students with a diversity of talents, skills, and backgrounds to help us make sense of the changes and their broader implications, and to address the new types of challenges we face that simply didn't exist a few years ago. And ETS wants to help build inclusive communities. And as a nonprofit organization whose mission it is to help advance quality and equity in education, we are in the position to do so. At its core, ETS is more than a testing company. We are an educational research institution. When we were created in 1947, ETS brought to life the idea that an organization dedicated to educational research and assessment could make vital contributions to the advancement of education worldwide. Since then, ETS has grown into a global organization that offers opportunities for learners around the world. An ever-changing world in which diverse, talented graduates lend their innovative thoughts, expertise, and enthusiasm to solving complex problems requires a diverse and inclusive student and faculty ecosystem. That is why we are so proud to partner with NNSTOY and this amazing team of researchers who developed the Build for Equity report. I am pleased now to introduce them to you. Leanne Erickson was a 2019 Iowa Teacher of the Year finalist and is the Executive Director for Undone Consulting. Justin Minkle is the 2007 Arkansas Teacher of the Year and currently teaches at Jones Elementary School in Arkansas. Josh Parker is the 2012 Maryland Teacher of the Year and a Senior Consultant at Education First. And Dr. Brenda Tufte is the 2012 North Dakota Teacher of the Year and the Chair of Graduate Education and a Professor of Education at the University of Mary. Unfortunately, due to scheduling conflicts, Dr. Jamela Coles is unable to join us today, but I would be remiss not to mention her as a critical member of this team. Dr. Coles is the 2014 Georgia Teacher of the Year and Director of Teacher Leadership at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts. And with that, I will pass it back to Scott to moderate the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamal, for sharing that critical background information on this report and our authors. First, I'd like to ask Brenda about the paper's methodology and process. What methodology did the team use to create this work and formulate your recommended actions in the report?
Thank you, Scott. I'm happy to speak to that. So we began with NNSTOY, and NNSTOY put out a call for applicants and for this work. And so we gathered a team of committed educators who are experienced and committed to equity work. And I remember that first meeting that Josh, that you led, and you asked us each to bring forward our why. So we first identified the purpose of our work, which was to diversify the educator pipeline. And then we went to the why. Why was it important for all of us? And why was it important for everyone? And we talked about improved outcomes for students, improved outcomes for educators and community members and families. That why was really at the foundation of our work. And that's where we began. So in stage one of our research, we took a deep dive into the review of related literature. We looked at current research that has been done in equity work. Looking at that research helped us to identify where there were obstacles, where there were gaps that existed that need attention and need work. And it also, I think, highlighted some pockets of innovation that are going on that we could look at more deeply that could possibly be scaled because some of those things were working. And so I think that was an important part of our research to give us that base. And then the second stage of our research, we really went into gathering some primary data. And that was a fun part of the research. We gathered panelists of educators from all over the nation. So we had very diverse panels, people working in schools, working in HR, administrators who were responsible for hiring. We brought just a diverse group to the table, and we did those focus group interviews, and we led several of those over several evenings, and that really provided some powerful data for us, and it provided also some excellent triangulation so that we weren't just relying on, a very few number of sources. So after that, our next step was to analyze that data. And we formed some themes, and we went back then to the overall body of literature, and we just, expanded that. And it really, that primary and secondary data is what formed the outline of our work. And that was what we used to conduct our writing and also to make our recommendations for the Build for Equity paper.
Thank you so much for touching on that. Really appreciate it. Would love for you, if it would be possible, to share the really the process for choosing the research for your literature review. If you can go into that maybe a little bit more for our attendees.
Sure, thank you for asking that. So we really tried to focus on peer-reviewed sources and research that had that evidence base to it. And we also look to publications from organizations that are doing outstanding equity work, the Center for Black Educator Development, Educators Rising, the U.S. Department of Education, Johns Hopkins. We really relied on those sources as well as those peer-reviewed sources that we were able to access through university databases.
Thank you for sharing that additional context, as well as some of the incredible organizations in our country that are leading in the equity work and diversifying our educator pipeline. Would you be able to share with our attendees how the team decided on literature review materials to analyze, considering just really the amount of literature review and research on this topic? Like how are you able to decide on what specifically to analyze?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I think it was important for all of us to focus on where educators were telling us there were obstacles, and also where educators were telling us this was instrumental for me in empowering me as an educator of color. This helped us diversify our workforce. And so we were focusing on obstacles and solutions, which I think is one of the unique aspects of our work that makes it so exciting. And once we formed those, we had 9 domains that we formed, and we really tried to narrow to those domains. And it wasn't easy to stay focused on that because there is a lot of information, a lot of good studies out there, but that was really how we made our decisions.
Thank you so much for walking us through the methodology component that's critically important to this work. Apologies for that background noise. And want to, you had mentioned about the domains that we'll be getting into. So what were 2 or 3 main takeaways you had from your team's findings? Is there anything that surprised you the most? And I'd like to pitch these questions to Justin and Leanne as well.
So Scott, I believe Josh Parker has a hard stop in about 10 minutes. Is that right, Josh? And if so, I wondered if you wanted to speak first, Josh.
Yeah, I do, but I have a little bit longer. But I just really appreciate some of the collaboration that has happened amongst all of us. So you all were doing a majority of the work, and Jamel and I were supporting. So I'd love to just hear your response, and I can stay on a little bit longer. So I thank you, Justin, for that.
Sure. So the first thing I would say that stood out to me is the degree to which recruitment and retention of teachers of color is rooted in the experience of students of color, right? If a child doesn't feel seen or cared for from kindergarten through high school, if they don't see their identity and experiences reflected in their teachers, in the books they read, in the content they study, they're probably not going to want to return to that world of the classroom for years or decades more as a teacher. And that cycle perpetuates itself. And the thing that's really hopeful to me, though, is that if we make the kinds of changes we're advocating for in the Build for Equity report, we flip that cycle, right? If students of color feel loved, feel seen, if they see themselves in their teachers, many of them will choose to return to the classroom as teachers, and that in turn nurtures the next generation of teachers of color. Leanne, did you want to speak to this point?
Yeah, thank you, Justin. I think to build on that point, one of the exciting things that revealed to us is just how much we all play a role in diversifying the pipeline, no matter where we are within the system of education. But all people work to create a culture of positive experiences for our students of color. And we saw that, as you said, as a critical element to diversifying the pipeline later, so that students want to come back to a place where they felt loved. And so whether you are a classroom teacher or a food service worker or an administrator, you play a role in building that culture. And we really hope that empowers you. I think sometimes when we think about the work of diversifying the pipeline, we see that as work of hiring managers, HR teams, and administrators. But what was revealed to us is that the pipeline really starts in pre-K, and how those students are met with love and joy all the way through their K-12 experience.
Yeah, I think that's a really deep point. Another thing that stood out to us is that most of the problems that face teachers of color in terms of recruitment and retention are the same kinds of problems that afflict the teaching profession as a whole, but they're much more acute for teachers of color. If you look at disrespect, low pay for exhausting work, and kind of lack of professional autonomy in a system where a lot of times the people closest to the work of educating children actually have the least say over the policies that govern their classrooms. Those are they hit teachers of color hardest. And because those problems hit them hardest, we realize that we need more robust and targeted systems to counter them. Strong mentoring programs, higher pay, time built into the school day for preparation and collaboration, meaningful professional development, and formalized roles for teacher leadership. And just at kind of a bare minimum, as a starting point, we realized that districts need to be collecting data on the racial diversity of their teachers and principals, and setting quantifiable goals and an action plan for how to meet them, which isn't in place yet in some places. And beyond that, we need to change the power structure of those who either choose to maintain or change the current reality in schools, from the superintendent to the school board. So Leanne, do you have other thoughts on that?
Yes, and I think what you're talking about and envisioning is a broader understanding of what education in school really means. And so one thing that we learned throughout our research was how much community matters as well. Educators of color want community support too, and recognize and said that they will not go into a community where they do not feel like they will belong. And so when we think about education, we really have to move beyond the classroom and think about how our whole community is impacting education, and particularly, and also how we view that community. If we are working in a community predominantly of people of color, are we speaking about that community from a deficit mindset or an asset mindset? That will directly affect the educators of color who are in the school right there. If we are working in a predominantly white community, how is that community acting in culturally responsive ways? So I think it really is important to think beyond the school, particularly when we think about retention. of educators of color, which was another important point, that the pipeline, again, really goes from kindergarten all the way through the hiring, and then retention is such a key element as well.
Yeah, and that was something that really hit me, is that states and districts tend to focus more on recruitment than on retention. And there's a reason for that, right? I think the reason is that working on retention is harder. It requires real structural shifts, redesign, and shifts in power. But if we don't fix those conditions that are driving teachers of color in particular out of the profession, it's like pouring water into a bucket with a hole at the bottom, right? It doesn't matter how many wonderful, skilled, caring teachers of color we recruit if the conditions that they're then entering drive them out within a couple of years, and we have to move toward a system where teachers have greater decision-making power, where they can question bad policies without being labeled troublemakers, and where the level of pay reflects the level of expertise required to do the work, right? Where teachers have the professional autonomy to do right by the children in their care. And the last thing I would say about this is that working in both teacher leadership and teacher equity, I hear the same language a lot that troubles me, which is allow and give. Like teachers of color must be allowed to take on teacher leadership roles. Teachers should be given a seat at the table when the decisions that shape their classrooms are made. But if someone in power is allowing you to have autonomy, they can also choose not to grant that autonomy, right? If you question things that they don't want questioned. If someone is giving you a seat at the table, they can also take that seat away. And so I think we need to work toward a system where teacher leaders, including teachers of color, have decision-making power as a fundamental right, as a best practice that we know results in policies that work better for children, work better for their families, and not as a favor that's conditionally and often temporarily granted. One of our goals in this paper was to directly address the structural changes, the power shifts that need to happen in order to make this change. So Leanne, did you have anything else you wanted to add before we pivot to Josh?
I just want to give a here to that exact comment. And I think it really reflects how much our language matters. So think about that, the words that we're using when we come to the table and talk about hiring. Think about the words that we're using in our professional development meetings. The words that we use matter, and are the words that we're saying accurately reflecting the goals that we have within a system of equity, and are we able to measure those goals as well? I think that's just another really valuable point. One thing that we found in our research is a lot of districts have equity goals, but then really aren't measuring anything new. So they're not actually able to collect data and analyze data that measures goals, because they're not sure exactly what to measure. And we're hopeful that this paper includes some really great resources for you to be able to do that, to not just make the equity goal, but then to measure it and ensure that it's happening.
Yeah, and I'll provide some more information policy-wise later, but I want to tag into that, the idea of the tension between retention and recruitment, but also really philosophically, this idea of adaptive versus technical, right? Adaptive changes are those that you have to change something deeper. You might even call it, change at order 1, order 2, right? Where you're changing your beliefs, your values, your habits about something. And technical change, which is also important, it's about changing processes and structures. What we have found sort of in the research and in this report, and you'll see it, is that a lot of people would love to solve an adaptive issue of recruiting teachers of color with technical fixes. So they want to have more job fairs, right, in certain communities, right? Or we're going to recruit more at these particular places. And while those are admirable, they're still technical fixes, because if we don't work on the conditions that teachers of color are experiencing when they get into the profession, we'll have just slapped a technical fix on an adaptive problem. And what our paper hopefully is trying to push us into is, through these different domains, here are some of the adaptive changes you have to make via the questions we're asking you to consider, so that you can not only make technical changes, but adaptive ones as well.
I really appreciate how you all have touched on that this is work that involves patterns of behavior, structures, and the importance of also school and district and community partnerships. This is, everyone has to be a part of the solution in order to address this challenge and truly create a structure and culture that is focused on the attraction, retention, and development of our diverse educators. And appreciate you all sharing those key components of it. And I think that this makes for a great transition into specifically the recommendations that you all mentioned. We want our attendees and stakeholders to be able to find a particular area or areas of the educator pipeline that they can focus on, and then not only have goals, but put progress monitoring practices in place to be able to see the progress towards those goals. Can you start by sharing what these recommendations were based on the report's findings? And Josh, I'd love for you to kick it off.
Yeah, a lot of our recommendations, you can argue that they're common sense, but I don't think they're common practice, right? And so I want to go back into what we just talked about, which is what is causing you, or what are you thinking about changing in terms of what you're loyal to, what you believe in, and what you bring into this conversation to actually make what is a common sense practice or idea actually a common sense and widely implemented strategy. So with each particular domain, we provide not just reflection questions to consider and personal stories. And I want to encourage everybody on this call to really dig into this report. And you can certainly take your time through it or focus on the particular domain that applies most to your situation. But there's a lot of good things that are in here. And we have these action steps, Scott, and I'm going to kind of talk about just a couple, right? So under domain number 1, the student experience, one of our action steps is, hey, implement support for Black or Indigenous persons of color teachers into the structure of the school week. What does mentoring look like? How are we connecting teachers of color? When I was in schools, in some of them, there were strong structural connections between teachers of color. In other schools, there weren't. And I felt the difference there. And I want to say this too as a point. I don't know if it's a nuanced point or not, but even though you can be in a school with a lot of teachers of color and there still not be connection amongst the teachers of color because the structures have not been built in to support that. And so that's just one piece we talk about. Something else that really struck me among the domain of affirmation, we had an action step to adamantly oppose laws and policies that prevent educators of color from telling their stories and histories. I bring this up specifically because we do have other planks within the All for Equity strategy that are speaking to this, but we have to be able to have leadership in these organizations that oppose something that will be sort of a chilling effect on teachers of color coming into the environment. If there are laws and restrictions on people that look like me telling our story, then we're less likely to enter into that institution. So these recommendations are for all levels of leadership and contribution inside of a school system. And I'll just do one more. There's so many good action steps. I actually don't know how to choose just one, but I'm going to go to domain 6, the gatekeepers. I love this domain so much. And one of the pieces that's really, really important is that you set clear goals for diversity and have accountability for those goals. So lots of people, especially since some of the racial unrest in the past couple of years, have embraced the idea that Black Lives Matter, right? And that's appreciated. But the way that Black Lives Matter, as well as brown lives, as well as those that have been marginalized, is when those lives matter in the goals and accountability systems that you can be judged by, right? How can I be judged as a good school district if I don't have a good hiring record for diverse candidates, right? So we actually have to tie the things that we believe in to the accountability for what makes us reported as good. There has to be clear goals and clear definitions. And here's what's beautiful about this. This policy recommendation, Scott, also means that you're talking to the community about it. You're talking to folks about what should be a clear goal, what should be a diversity goal for our school, right? You had mentioned, Scott, earlier, the dissonance between how many educators are white and how many students of color are now populating our schools. Like, if you set clear goals with that in mind and then have accountability for that, That's a path to moving forward. I'll end like with this, which is all these changes are great ideas, but the commitment and the accountability for them to happen is what will catalyze it.
I appreciate you sharing that, Josh, very much, and want to give opportunity for any of our other panelists if they would like to share their reaction to the policy recommendations from their experience building this report.
You know, as I was listening to Josh and Justin and Leanne, the stories that the panelists shared during our focus group discussions, you know, really reinforced those recommendations. And I'm thinking about a teacher of color who was experienced and talented and said, I didn't even apply for that position because I just didn't think I had a chance of being hired in that district. And other teachers sharing what it was like to go to an interview and the entire interview team is white and not one teacher of color, and no talk about affirmation spaces, just really telling their stories about feeling like I don't belong in this school district. And that prevented them from sometimes accepting positions and sometimes even worse, of even applying for the position. And, you know, those stories led to one of our recommendations, which is to reach out to teachers of color and encourage them to apply. Not just, you know, sort of throwing up your hands and saying, well, we didn't have any applicants. Did you reach out to anyone? What are you doing in your school that would help all teachers to feel supported and to make them feel like they do belong?
Yeah, and I just wanted to respond to a couple of questions that were in the chat. You know, most of my experience has been teaching Latinx students from the Marshall Islands who are first and second generation immigrants. And I remember years ago being at a convening of higher ed and workforce where they said, you know, the number of Latinx students in our schools is expected to go from 5% to 23% over the next 12 years. And so my question to them was, well, then what are we doing in terms of changing, you know, teacher ed, in terms of changing professional development so that every teacher has a deep grounding in techniques for teaching English learners? And there wasn't really a response at that point. And so I think that's another really important factor when it comes to English learners specifically. You know, a point that Josh has made a lot is that when we build in these systems to support students of color, they tend to be good for a whole bunch of different kids, even all kids, right? And I've definitely found that when it comes to instructional techniques in terms of preparing teachers for English learners, right? Building in intentional language support, thinking about more experiential learning, and models like the gradual release are critical. You know, they're essential for English learners, but they also have a tremendous impact on kind of improving the educational experience of students of any background.
I just want to add too, I think and I saw a question too about prep programs. And as one of the things that encouraged me so much as we were listening to the panel discussions was how many really amazing things educators are doing out there to really make some changes. And I think one action item can be to branch out and see what exciting things are happening in your state. Dr. Tufte is working with Dr. Carmelita Lamb to create an incredible para-professional to educator pipeline. Lots of states, particularly Arizona, are working on ensuring Indigenous populations are represented within the teaching profession. So there really are amazing people doing amazing things that we can partner with as well. So I would encourage you to just see what other people in your state are doing and think about how you as a school district can partner with them. How can you ensure that you are welcoming diverse student teacher populations into your school from a variety of types of programs? I think that could be a really powerful place to begin as well. One of the panelists, this stuck with me so much, and I said during one of our discussions, what if we went into the community and said, give us your best and your brightest, because we want them to be teachers. And that just was so empowering, encouraging, and true, right? Our profession is so important. So of course, we want to be able to encourage the most amazing of young people that are in our communities to be educators. And then we want to be able to ensure that education is a space where they can show up fully as themselves, because that is going to be a more joyful and a more equitable education space. So it gets me really excited to think about doing this well.
I love it how you all are getting to the action. It's we have looked at the research, we have listened to first-person perspective, we've created 9 domains to really focus on in specific recommendations, and I really want our attendees to be able to have your all's perspective on where do we go next. I think everyone here today, including yourselves, know how difficult it can be to actually implement recommended actions. And we want our attendees and education stakeholders to feel after today's conversation that we're not trying to boil the ocean. And oftentimes we know we need to take action, but maybe not where exactly where to start, or maybe there are schools and districts and states that are in different starting positions. So given all of that, where do you all recommend decision makers should start in focusing on their educator diversity work pipeline?
Yeah, I would mention 2 things. One of them is that teacher academies, like in high schools, have been really effective. And we met with some people, like a principal who actually does it earlier, like elementary school, starts talking to children who might be interested in coming back to their alma mater, or at least to their community or region, and joining this profession. And sometimes just telling them, look, you would be a great teacher, right? And when it comes time to look at what you want to do in college, like, get in touch with me, I'll be there to support you if you want to become a teacher. But going back to Leanne's point about the best and brightest, right? Like, I had a remarkable student in 2nd and 3rd grade when I looped with my class who knew she wanted to be a teacher, but she got in touch with me now that she's graduating high school. And she said, I'm undocumented and I don't even have a way to show that I am who I say I am. And so we have to look at those barriers, because we really need a pathway for students who might have a harder time walking that road, especially in terms of kind of crippling student loan debt when they come out the other side. So it's not just kind of encouraging students to enter the profession, but then the support they need to kind of follow through to the other end.
I'd love to segue off of that, Justin. And I think that when we're recruiting teachers of color to the pipeline, one of the things we came across in our research is that they're often taking on more debt. And that becomes problematic because the School of Education is a bachelor's degree compared to other bachelor degrees is not paying as much. And so you have kind of that combination of lower wages and higher debt. And I think we've traditionally relied on grant money coming in to try to support teachers of color and all teachers to solve the teacher shortage from the Department of Education, the Department of Indian Ed. And recently, Tennessee just opened up the pathway to tap into the Department of Labor dollars through apprenticeship grants. Because of our student teaching component, it qualifies as an apprenticeship. And that's a first. And so, Tennessee has kind of paved the way. And so I think as far as where to start, to understand that sometimes there's got to be financial support to get the best and brightest that Leanne talked about. And so those innovative ways of looking for funding sources, and anytime you want to apply for grant money, you certainly have to show that it's working somewhere. And that's where I think the research that we presented on what's working and what could possibly be scaled might be helpful for people who are applying for those funds to try to support getting teachers of color into the pipeline.
That's such a great point, Brenda. And one of the other things, if you're just sort of looking for a place to start, look at those questions in each domain. I think those will be really helpful for you. And then also remember that, as Scott said, you don't have to boil the ocean. You don't have to attack all domains at one time. Go to an area that maybe you've already started some work in, or an area that you feel that you really need to put in some extra work. And one thing we did was create a very, very simple protocol. Is when you think that really modeled in some ways our research, but when you think about each domain, you really want to think about who do you need to talk to, and ensuring that you're talking to a diverse group of people. That's critical, right? We don't want to just make policy based on our own experiences, our own personal experiences. So ensuring having an understanding of who you need to talk to within the community, within the school district, et cetera. Looking at which systems and policies you really need to analyze, and whether that's your hiring policy, whether that's what the language that is embedded in your handbook. These are all things that can really support or help you understand what your initial steps would be. And also, what data do you need to look at? What do you already have? What do you need to collect? And is the data telling the whole story? I heard someone say the other day that numbers tell stories, and it's true. And are your numbers telling the whole story of your space? And I think that's a critical question to ask as well.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, especially with Scott's point, one thing I realized in this work is that it's not our job to make the system perfect. It's not going to happen in the scope of work we can control. It is our job to make the system better. And in some ways, that's really easy to do. In some districts, even just beginning to capture the data, right? Even looking at disciplinary practices, right? Creating affinity groups for teachers of color, even if it needs to be online in places where there are very few teachers of color. Looking at the books in the classroom library, right? Are they reflective of students' identities and experiences? And so it's not that you have to take on, again, like all 9 of these domains, but I think they can support you when you consider kind of that intersection of what do you care about most deeply, and then what are you in a position to change given your specific context.
I want to keep this rich conversation going and want to also have some time for our attendees who are asking us questions, and appreciate you all also noting the different resources that are available. Dr. Tufte, I'm a little bit biased on your comment about grow your own, being I am in Nashville, Tennessee, and came to NNSTOY from the Tennessee Department of Education. And so appreciate the shout out on the grow your own work. And I'm very proud that the Tennessee Department of Education put together playbooks and guides specifically for districts and post-secondary institutions and communities to partner to grow their own educator workforce, and have made that publicly available to every state. And so I very much hear what all of our panelists are saying if we are reducing the barriers, we need to be addressing the financial components as well to be able to enter and stay in school and on track for post-secondary attainment. And student teaching necessary to enter the profession. And now U.S. Department of Labor dollars are unlocked through the teacher apprenticeship as well as other state and private sector funding resources from philanthropy. I'm looking at, and if you have any questions for our attendees, please feel free to put those in the chat. I am looking through them now. And if you have a question, please use the question and answer feature so that we can be sure that it's captured. And I'm also going to ask my colleagues if there are questions that they are seeing come through, if they could elevate those to me as well through the chat. I am looking through them right now.
I just want to elevate Gloria's point, and a few folks responded to it as well about, and I think Justin, you mentioned this, the additional burdens that are placed on educators of color, on bilingual educators. And I think one thing that administration can do in that moment until they're able to hire enough people to share the work is to compensate for that additional work, to be able to provide meaningful compensation, because that honors the expertise that those people hold as they do that additional work. Absolutely. So thanks for sharing that, Gloria.
Absolutely. A question for the panel. So in reading this report and looking at specifically the domains and the recommendations, what would you recommend for our attendees who are meeting with, let's say, their school district as a next step to specifically look at the current work or growing the work in the educator diversity pipeline. What would you recommend to them? Let's say they're in front of the executive director of HR for their school district and her or his team. What would you recommend to either initiate the work or build upon the district's current work in this space?
You know, I think one of the most important things we can do is to really encourage school leaders to elevate teacher leadership. And, you know, teacher leadership is so vital because, number one, we're closest to the students, know the standards well, and understand the pedagogy and the support needed. And I think that we have to take a good hard look and look around to make sure that we have diverse representation on those teacher leadership teams. You know, sometimes I think equity work can be so overwhelming. And one thing that became so apparent in doing the research is that many of the challenges are system-wide. And that can seem overwhelming. People begin to almost disengage and think, well, we can't change the system. You know, one person can't change the system, and that's true. But together we can change the system, and we can work on our corner of the world and what is going on in our school and our district. And so we change the system together by partnering. And I think NNSTOY so beautifully exemplifies the power of partnering.
I think too, to respond to that question, I think this is one of the places where this paper can be incredibly helpful. I think you can take it and sit down in a meeting with HR, with your hiring team, and really try to do an honest analysis of where your district is within each of the 9 domains. What it does, what the paper does so well, is it provides such clear outlines of what each domain means, of what should be happening within each domain, what teachers from around the country are saying about each domain, built in with the personal stories, which certainly would probably bring to mind people within your own district. So I think this paper can really serve as a guidebook for you to do an analysis of your culture, of your community, of your hiring practices, et cetera. And then I think you'll begin, the place to start will become more apparent if you use the paper in that way. So that's one of the things that's exciting to me about this work. And I think it would be really helpful for people who have that meeting with them and are able to have that conversation with their district leaders.
I would also say, you know, and this is for teacher leadership of any kind, framing it in terms of student well-being, right? Sometimes it starts to be politicized, or it starts to be said, oh, if you're into equity, you're into this particular political approach, right? And I think the reality is, if you look at the data, it's really incontrovertible in terms of the well-being of students, in terms of student learning for children of color. And then beyond that, it's not taking anything away, right? Like if we increase the number of teachers of color, like research has shown, white students also benefit from having teachers of color, right? Asian American students benefit from having Black teachers, right? There are these benefits that are documented to student learning and social emotional well-being. I also wanted to respond, and Brenda, you may be able to speak better to this, but I know there was the question about looking at kind of teacher prep programs. And one aspect of that is in domain 2, the access, you know, in terms of looking at licensure requirements and assessments. And we also talked about it in terms of preparing student teachers to teach students of color, right? Because we're kind of looking at this in 2 ways. One is increasing the number of teachers, principals, powerful people in powerful positions of color. The other one, though, is for white teachers, making sure that they're also getting a foundation, for example, in teaching English learners, in cultural sensitivity, right, in restorative justice, so that we're not treating Black boys in particular, for example, differently for the same infractions as white students. But I didn't know, Brenda or Leanne, if you wanted to speak more to that question of teacher prep and higher ed.
Yeah, I think that's vitally important, Justin. And I think we're seeing a number of education programs put more emphasis on that. And then, you know, disproportionately, we're seeing them being stifled in some ways and monitored. And so I think we have to have that moral courage to make sure that we bring that to the table, and that we are preparing all teachers to know students well and to see all of them as individuals. And I think just, you know, telling our stories, I appreciate Alicia asking, you know, where do we begin? And I think telling our stories and having our students tell their stories, those stories really transcend data points, and they really make people sort of stop and think, I don't want that happening in my school. I don't want my students to be experiencing that, or family members to be experiencing that. And so they're able to kind of rally around that. And I think that's also the bridge that students are willing to cross to get to difficult content and to create those environments that support all students.
Appreciate you all touching on Jamie's question about the student teaching. I want to lastly address Emily's question on what should be the first thing we can do as teachers to get started in this work.
So one thing I would say is I think for white teachers in particular, there's a lot about what not to do, but there aren't as many positive stories of a white teacher who got better at handling discipline, a white teacher who got better in terms of using culturally responsive text. And so I think it's almost like with little kids, right? We tell them like, use your walking feet. We don't tell them don't run. You know, I think we need to look at the harm done by racist practices, absolutely. But I think we also need to really try to pay attention to what is within our sphere of influence, you know, educating ourselves, but also taking little actions every day, right? Looking at the read alouds that you use in class. Are they reflecting the identities and experiences of your students? You know, who are maybe some guest speakers who you have come in? If you're a white teacher, you can still bring in visitors of color to speak to really specific topics that you're studying. And so I think we need to do this big systemic approach. And that's why we have these domains, but the domains aren't sequential, right? You can look at one domain that's relative to your work. And when it comes to just a classroom level, again, maybe we can't make it perfect. Maybe we're not the teacher we want to be yet, but we can start thinking about the bridge between where we are now and where we want to be in terms of doing right by our students of color and also advocating for our colleagues of color to make these bigger, more systemic changes.
I just want to speak to that, Justin, to your point, you know, and I, as a white educator, and I had the opportunity, and earlier in my career, I taught at schools that had a lot more students of color. And then in the past several years in my career, taught predominantly in schools with mostly white students. And as Justin said, there is so much you can do to empower and encourage white students and to create the kind of culture that will send them out to create communities of belonging. And also to understand that when our school system is segregated to the extent that 40% of our schools do not have a single teacher of color in them, in the state of Iowa, where I am at, 94% of Iowa educators identify as white. You have to do things and you can do things as a classroom educator to desegregate the classroom experience. As Justin said, bringing in guest speakers, ensuring that your texts are diversified, that you are having conversations that speak to and share a variety of voices, and that you're teaching your students to really ask questions, right? To ask questions, to hear and to listen. That's a big key, I think. So within the classroom, there's so much you can do to build cultural competency that will pay dividends, not just for diversifying the teacher pipeline, but for building a more equitable world.
Yeah, and Leanne, do you mind talking? Like, I asked you a question once at a conference, and I loved your answer. And it was specifically about helping students become allies. And it was after my own son related a story shortly after COVID started of someone calling a Chinese American student coronavirus. And I asked my child, well, what did you do? And he said, I didn't do anything. I didn't know what to do. So could you just briefly speak to that in terms of helping your students, what you've done to help them become allies?
Yeah, I mean, that specific instance was one thing that we really practiced within our school. I think white students need to practice how to be allies. So we talked about different scenarios, whether you hear something in a hallway or you're part of a conversation where something is said, and what are some things that you can say, even if it's as simple as, hey man, that's not cool. That pays dividends. As we all know, when you say nothing, you're saying something really big. And then we would practice, and then we would encourage each other so that we would share incidences of, hey, I heard this and I spoke up and here's what I said. And then we would talk a little bit about how that went and what the response might have been and how we could do better. I think the thing that we practiced a lot even was receiving critical feedback on our own interactions and words, and then being able to go forward to be able to do better when we know better. And I think that white students need practice. This is not innate. This is not ingrained. I would say the opposite is true. Biases are innate and ingrained. They showed up in my own teaching practice because of how I was raised and educated. And so I think that we really have to do a lot of unlearning with our students and teaching and encouraging and equipping and reminding them that as white educators, if you're a white educator in this space or a white student, you have a role to play. It's not the same role as an educator of color or a student of color, but you have a role to play and it's important and you have a responsibility.
Thank you, Leanne, particularly for touching on the role and the responsibility of every individual in this work and how to engage not just educators, educator leaders, but also our students that our educators are supporting every single day. Really appreciate you touching on that. And before we close out, I just have to thank each of our incredible panelists, Leanne Erickson, Justin Minkle, Josh Parker, and Dr. Brenda Tufti for their time and dedication to this team, as well as Dr. Jamal Watson for presenting this morning, and ETS's incredible support and partnership in supporting teacher leaders within advancing the teaching profession and student achievement. I'd ask all of our attendees to please take a moment to access our report on their screen right now and share broadly across your platforms using the hashtag #BuildForEquity and tagging us at NNSTOY. Now, remember at the top of the hour, when I said before you click on the leave webinar button that we want you to take away the various components of the report that you'd be able to use for your purposes. Take a moment to think about how you want to address the teacher workforce pipeline and its diversity efforts. And please reach out to NNSTOY as a partner in this work. We greatly value being able to support schools, districts, and organization in how teacher leaders can advance their goals. May it be teacher leadership development, social emotional support, or educator diversity. Our teacher leaders are incredibly well positioned with their experience at the grassroots and the grass tops level to support your school, your district, and community in this work. And we want to keep moving forward together with our partner organizations and partners like you all. Thank you again so much for joining us this morning. We look forward to connecting with you how you might be incorporating the learnings within our report so we can keep this conversation and these actions of addressing our educator workforce pipeline and diversifying it together. And we hope to see you all again soon at the next NNSTOY webinar. Thank you all so much and hope you have a great rest of the week.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.